Welcome to another podcast of the Roots Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Pitcher. Today's guest we have on is Alan Frost. Alan is the founder and president of FlavaNaturals. He has over 20 years of experience as an entrepreneur and business executive. We recently met a few weeks back. I thought the product he had was very interesting, especially because I'm a huge nitrates fan for my athletes and utilizing that to help with performance and just overall health in general. We're really going to go into the weeds and talk about this a little bit more and how this could be a benefit and how he kind of came to creating this idea of developing this product. But Alan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Sean, it's great to be here. Great to be at the Roots podcast. And it was awesome to meet you a few weeks ago, and looking forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. So let's start out with Alan. What is your roots?
My roots. So I was born in Wayne, New Jersey. So I'm a Jersey boy, like Bruce Springsteen, but I can't sing. And so I two small family, two great parents who are still with us. A sister, and grew up playing a lot of basketball and running as well. Went to the University of Delaware, the Fighting Blue Hens, and majored in accounting, which I don't really recommend on most people, but did a few years of that. Realized that wasn't for me. Went back to business school, started a family, and now I have two beautiful kids. You may see them behind me. That's when they're real small. Now they're both out of the house. One living in
They grow up
Brooklyn.
so fast, right?
Yeah, my God, crazy. Yeah, so one in Brooklyn and one not too far. We're living. My wife and I are living just outside of Boston now. So in a town called Marblehead, about just 20 minutes outside of Boston. And my son's been living locally, but now he's moving to DC. So we're truly empty nesters now.
How ironic. My mentor lives in Boston, and the last person I had on the podcast went to University of Delaware as well.
Oh, you're kidding me.
What's the chance?
You're gonna have to rename this the Blue Hen Podcast.
The Blue Hand Podcast. I don't know about that, but yeah, y'all have a really nice facility up there now. I mean, I had met, I think, Miss Rossi is their dietitian now. I know they have like a fairly brand new weight room that I think Joe Flacco contributed to. So it definitely looks like their facility from a sports center is definitely really
Yeah, they
awesome
do
out in
have
comparison to what it used
some
to
great.
look like.
Yeah, they have great facilities.
Yeah, so FlavaNaturals, where did this idea come from? How did it start? How did you get involved with it?
Yeah, so it's a funny story. I spent over 20 years in the biotech pharmaceutical industry. After going to business school and kind of shifting gears from that accounting background. And then the company I worked for got bought out, and I was thinking about, okay, what's next? What do I want to do? And it turned out, in hindsight, to be a great opportunity. And I decided I want to do something more entrepreneurial. I was looking at a bunch of things, and one day my wife walks in, right where I'm sitting now, and throws the paper in my lap and said, "I told you we should eat more chocolate." And I was like, "Come on, Sherry." And so I started reading this article, and that article said chocolate improves memory. And this is like 7 years ago. You may have seen it. It was like it's on all the news, it was on all the paper, etc. And I was really skeptical because in biotech, you're always skeptical of this kind of stuff,
You
right?
see a lot of stuff and it's one paper and it gets blown up on the social media and you're like, well, let me look at some more
Yeah,
research before I can like 100% commit to this.
exactly. It's one paper, it's one mouse. It's anyway. So I started reading this, and this was a study that was done at Columbia University. And it wasn't huge, but the investigators knew exactly what they're doing, and they were looking at the speed of memory recall. And in that particular study, they were looking at a group of 60 to 70-year-olds. And they found out after 3 months of consuming this chocolatey drink, their speed to memory recall improved by 2.5 decades. Because unfortunately, from the time we're like 25, that kind of ratchets down a little bit, right? Like every year, not for everybody, but for most people. And I was really, really impressed with the data. And I started digging around and found that, not only is there data, so these there's not only data in cognition, but there's even more data on the cardiovascular front, mood, even some on exercise performance. And what was going on as I learned about this is these cocoa flavanols, the antioxidants in dark chocolate. They're what's good for you, right? In dark chocolate, they're vasodilators, and so they improve blood flow, and that's kind of the root of of all the benefits, right? That you see with the cocoa flavanols. And there's some tremendous data out there. The catch was, I'm reading all these studies, and including this one at Columbia, and they're all testing 500 to 900 milligrams of cocoa flavanols a day. So the data is real. The benefits are amazing, but your average dark chocolate bar only has 100 milligrams. So you're seeing all this, you're hearing about these stories. Oh, dark chocolate's good for you. Cocoa is good for you. But traditional dark chocolate and cocoa powder don't have nearly the amount that they're using in these great studies. So that's where the idea for the business came from. We kind of said, listen, if we could develop a natural product that's great tasting, that has the flavanol levels that are being used in these studies, this could be an interesting business.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that in a lot of different like supplements or just foods in general. You have to eat double, triple, quadruple the amount to even like see the benefits. But the mainstream individual who just sees that article or sees something on social media
Yeah.
and so he thinks like, well, I should just start consuming this. But in reality, like you're not getting anywhere near the effects that you could, or it's may not even having the effects that we want out of it because you'd have to eat, let's say, I don't know what, 4, 5, 6 chocolate bars, which I don't think
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
going to
You
promote people
literally
to eat
would
like
have to eat, you
six, seven
literally have to
chocolate
eat
bars a day.
5 or 10 a day. Yeah.
I think a question I have off of that is just so like the listeners can differentiate. What is the difference between a milk chocolate versus a dark chocolate, if you could tell us? Because I think some people that may hear this think right off the bat, oh, chocolate's good for me. Maybe like your wife had done and say like, oh, well, I can eat any chocolate. I guess
Right.
what
Right.
differentiates a darker cocoa versus a milk chocolate we might get like in a candy bar at a store?
Yeah. So a milk chocolate typically has like 20-25% of what's in a milk chocolate is actually coming from the cocoa bean. So that's what you see referred to as the cacao percentage. And you don't even see that on the milk chocolate, right? You buy a Hershey bars, you don't see cacao percentage on the Hershey bar. But generally it's milk chocolate's about 25%. And the rest of it, there's some milk in there, obviously, but
Sugar.
a lot of sugar. And so the darker you get, the more cocoa beans in there. So when people say dark chocolate, they're typically referring to chocolate that's 50-60% cocoa bean, and a lesser percentage of and dark chocolate doesn't have any milk. So the rest of it is mostly sugar, outside of like maybe a little salt or whatever the manufacturer's putting in there.
And where do you guys get your cocoa beans from? I know we had talked offline, like there's specific countries where it's the best place to derive your product from specifically. Um, and obviously, we look into a lot of our products might come from South America. What are other factors we have to look into as well for like making sure that the product is grown appropriately in the area that it's done as well?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because a lot of people say, well, you know, why do your bars have more flavanols than a typical dark chocolate bar? Because our dark chocolate bars have about 500 milligrams per serving, so that's about 5 times the amount, and the cocoa powder even has more. So there's really the secret behind like developing a high flavanol dark chocolate or cocoa powder is really twofold. So one is where you are with bean selection. So let's start there. So bean selection, cocoa beans, like a lot of fruits and vegetables, we're finding the nutrient value depends on where you grow it and the type of bean and the soil and a lot of other things. So we source our beans from a handful of farms in Ecuador that have been cultivating what is like a great tasting, but also super high flavanol cocoa bean. But it is a fruit, so like it can, like the flavanol levels can vary from year to year, and when you're making claims, obviously you need to test that.
Mhm.
But yeah, so we source from a handful of farms in Ecuador that have been developing this high flavanol bean. And what's important to me as well is, I've been out to the farms, and these are, they take care of their workers extremely well. The working conditions are really, really good in Ecuador. That's not an area, where we've seen issues with child labor, et cetera, or anything like that. So, but that's the first part. The first part of the equation is you have to source a high flavanol bean. Most, like, if people say, well, I like lint 80% or whatever, how many flavanols does that have? And the easy answer is like, well, on average, most bars have about 100 milligrams. But the truth is that Lint, Hershey, 99% of manufacturers source their beans from different places all the time, or they source it from like what I call it, like a collective that gets their beans from hundreds of farms. So, one week they're using, farm beans from farm A and B, and then the next week it may be C and D. So the flavanol levels in, a typical brand are going to bounce all over the place. And
Super like inconsistent. You
yeah,
don't really know
exactly.
what you're going to get from, let's say, bar to bar in this case, or powder to powder.
Totally, totally.
Do you find global warming has played like a huge impact, obviously, like in the soil and the agriculture and like where people are making decisions with a lot of their food choices? Or it almost seems like certain crops are going to be hard to grow in certain areas because like of rising temperatures. And I've seen things where there's certain things where they're pushing up more north just because it is cooler, and like we may be able to grow certain crops up in other states that we weren't
Yeah.
before just because of the temperature. I mean, any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And that, fortunately, the farms that we're sourcing from haven't been affected in a dramatic way, but you're absolutely right, because it is dependent on the climate and the rain. So when we were just starting the business, we hadn't, it took us 2.5 years to actually develop like the recipe, figure out the sourcing, develop the recipes, get the taste profile where we wanted. But during that process, the beans that we use, that cocoa beans are harvested twice a year. And the second that year was an El Nino year. So that part of the world got a tremendous amount of rain during that season. And it turned out that the beans were affected. So like you could still make chocolate out of them, but they were smaller, they were a little shriveled up, and guess what? They didn't have the flavanol levels. So get back to your, is that, is it global warming, or is it, was that a natural cycle? Either way, it can affect the crop, right? So that's it taught us a lesson, right? That we need to be prepared for something like this. We need to, over time, diversify our sourcing of the beans, but also because there's these two picking seasons a year, we need to make sure we have enough inventory to at least get us through, 6 months in case there's another bad season.
Yeah, you always have to have a plan B and a plan C just because it's just so unpredictable nowadays. You never know what's going
Oh
to
my
happen.
God, yeah, yeah, and it's getting less predictable. The good news is that cocoa beans and cocoa powder, have, like cocoa powder you can keep for 3 years, and the quality pretty much remains the same, and the flavanol levels hold as long as it's kept at a constant temperature.
I was gonna say, is that because it's just dried? You don't have the moisture, you don't have other things that could essentially create bacteria, which just allows the shelf life to stay a little bit longer, or is there
Yeah,
something you mix with the cocoa that I guess would increase the shelf life?
yeah, and when we started, there weren't a lot of studies out there showing how long those flavanol levels were. So we've actually increased, the at first we said, okay, or the best buy date's got to be 1 year out, because I mean cocoa powder is good for at least 3 years, and quite honestly, it's never going to make you sick. But after 3 years, it starts to lose some of that flavor. But we kept it at 1 year until we had more data showing that, you can maintain these flavanol levels over a longer time.
So I guess what does the processing of a cocoa bean look like? I know with your product, and I've honestly heard this from a couple other companies that I've spoken with as well. It's just when you're processing a product like this, the temperature plays an enormous effect. Some companies may be heating some of their products to too high of a heat, which may be killing the micronutrients, let's say in this case the flavanols. Maybe it's something like a greens powder is killing like the good bacteria or enzymes that are in there. So is there a certain temperature you guys use? Is there a certain process specifically with cocoa beans that's more preferred so you can preserve those flavanols and the amount that we would need that's going to have that effect that we want, or keep it at that concentration we want?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Sean. So, I started the story saying like there's two key elements to having a high flavanol, product. And the first is the bean, the second is the processing. So like a typical chocolate and cocoa processing destroys most of the flavanols, in our cocoa powder. And it doesn't, like, you can buy a $10, bar of chocolate or, a very expensive cocoa powder, and it doesn't mean it's going to have any more flavanols than that Hershey bar. So it does, a lot of it comes down to processing, and there's a couple elements. So one is heat, as you said. So once you get over to in the prior, so you see there's some heat in the fermentation process, but there's typically more heat in the roasting process. So when cocoa beans are roasted, that's when you lose a lot of the flavanol. So there's actually, fortunately, there's a lot of good data. It shows that flavanols start to degrade at about 200 degrees. So, can you put your cocoa powder in your coffee if you choose to consume it that way? You can't, fortunately, and you're not going to lose any flavanols. But if you bake with, like, if you took the cocoa powder and you baked with it at 400 degrees for a half an hour, you'd lose about 35% of the flavanol. So it depends on the temperature and then how long you keep it there. But that one thing is the temperature. The second thing is a lot of chocolate and cocoa powder goes through like what they call an alkalization process, which is a chemical process which helps preserve it, makes the flavor like, maybe a little more mild. And you see that with some chocolates that also destroys flavanols. And then the last thing, which is kind of crazy, is oxidation. So exposure to oxygen. So it actually even impacts like how you mix, you mix everything together, and you don't want to, you don't want to do this.
Whip it really fast.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have to worry about that as a consumer, but when you're making the product,
You're like taking it from the bean to like the plant, processing it.
Yeah, I mean, that's not quite as important as the temperature or as the alkalization, but these are all things that you figure out during the process, and why it took us a couple years to get from concept to market.
That's why I always ask those questions, because like as a consumer, as a dietitian, right, when you have individuals asking you these questions and you don't have a first sight look at how this works, that's why I like to bring on different individuals, especially in the food realm, that can give us a little bit more in-depth information about that. Because like I've never been to a cocoa farm, I've never been to a cocoa processing plant, but at least like the examples that you're giving me, like I can visualize that and like, okay, well that makes relative sense. Or if I'm gonna cook or utilize it in this way, like maybe these are the better ways to use it in that sense. And I know eventually here we'll get to application and how much to use and when to use. But that's why I've been bringing on some more individuals like yourself, just so they can kind of explain that process. And I also did something with the Dairy Alliance. They've been great, and a couple other, like the Beef Council and Beef Association. More of these companies are either bringing on dietitians, so they have somebody in the field that can relate, or they're bringing on people and doing like a 1 or 2 day course. And it's like, hey, like the Dairy Alliance, they brought us out to a farm. We went to a farmer. He explained exactly how he has his cows, provide milk, and what his process is, and his creamery and all that. So it's just nice that companies are starting to invest and take a lot of effort into getting this information out to practitioners like myself and others, just so we can have a better understanding of that process. Because if you look at it, right, like we're the front line when a lot of people are coming to ask, like, how do I improve my feeling, my
Totally,
nutrition, my
totally.
sleep? Well, it really makes sense to have a person like that that can talk the talk with other dietitians or us being able to talk to strength coaches or mental
Yeah,
health or the
yeah,
athletes or the coaches. And, we have these questions come at us all the time. And, when we have the background information and we were able to see with our own eyes, it definitely makes it a lot easier to have those conversations versus, I'm always somebody, if I don't know the answer, I'm just going to go find the answer for somebody and then get them the best quality answer. But when you can have that real life experience, it definitely makes your answer a lot more powerful and a lot easier
yeah,
conversation to steer in the right
totally.
direction.
Totally. Yeah. People ask me like, oh, who are your influencers? And I was like, dietitians, because our biggest challenge is they've heard dark chocolate can be healthy, but they don't, if you say the word flavanols, they're like, it's fortunately there's been some news in the media of the last few years. So more and more people are saying, oh, I'm familiar, I've heard of that, but most people don't know that much. They don't know, how much, can I just eat any, 60% chocolate bar, like quick questions like that. Because, like one of the biggest misunderstandings actually, with chocolate is, it's all about this cacao percentage, right? How dark is the chocolate? Like if I eat an 80% bar, oh, I'm probably getting all the benefits, whether they know the word flavanols or not, they know the benefits, right? And the funny thing is, because what we just talked about, like the bean and the processing, I could show you two, 70% bars, and one bar will have 5 times the flavanols of the other, but they'll both be 70% cacao. So, you don't, like, if you don't like really dark chocolate, like, ours is only 62%, but it has more flavanols than any bar on the market. Like, you don't need to eat like a baker's chocolate
You
to
don't
get
need to eat this like
flavanol.
extremely bitter bar that you're like, I can barely hawk it down.
No, no, you don't have to. If you want to, you can, but like you don't have to.
It's funny you get that comparison. I had a mentor that's still to this day. She was from high school. She did nutrition classes. She did cooking classes, home ec. So we're very fortunate to have her, especially at that level, that age. So she did a little bit of a example for us where she took like 5 or 6 different omega-3 supplements and just went over to like, everything is not equal. The quality of everything you see, social media in the store isn't equal. So she took one that was NSF certified. And then she had 5 others that were just random ones she had bought from like
Right,
Walmart and CVS. She cut them all open and she put them in a glass of water. And she's like, as we know, fat floats to the top. So if this is 100% omega-3s, we should see like all the fat should be floating on top of the water,
right.
right? So the NSF certified one, boom, did exactly what it was supposed to, right? Third party tested, we
Yep,
knew it
yep.
was a good high quality product. The other ones, you would just see other stuff floating in the water. You'd see like sediments floating down to the bottom of the cup. So she was like, yep, that's fillers. Like that's stuff that they're adding to the supplement. Like they say it's, I don't know, 1,000 milligrams of omega-3, like X amount DHA, EPA. She goes, well, what is that stuff? Or it says it has 150 DHA and it has 150 EPA, but what's the other 700 milligrams? So it's like you really gotta. That's a lot of time, like us as practitioners, when we're like, if I'm bringing somebody like you, if I'm bringing a company on, it's like you have to really get it from the source, and you have to really be able to look at your labeling and know where it's sourcing, where it's coming from, and if you're in a position to know, like, are you actually getting what you're paying for? Because unfortunately, some of these companies are just selling you a product to sell you a product, but that doesn't mean like you're getting the full quality product that you feel and think you're getting and what the label is telling you at the end of the day,
Yeah,
which is
no,
unfortunate.
it's really unfortunate, and they're putting themselves at risk, their business at risk, their customers at risk, and they're being disingenuous with people. But unfortunately, like, the FDA doesn't have enough people
No,
out there, right, that are making sure. Like, I came from the biotech you so like, well,
you know.
good, if you're claiming 900 milligrams cocoflavanols, you better have 1,000. But that's just because that's the way I came up, and and also like that's it. If you want to be in the business for the long run and you care about people, and that's just not the way to operate. But
Yeah,
unfortunately,
yeah.
there's
The FDA
much
was,
of
I
that
think it
out
was
there.
FDA last week. They just had something where it was a supplement cup. Was it? I can't remember the exact name, but there was a supplement company like in Walmart, and they've had all these false claims and several other things happen, and they just like said like you got to pull all your stuff from the shelves.
And you know what? If that was enforced like properly by the FDA, my guess is like two
Most of
thirds
those things wouldn't even be on the shelves in the first place.
they wouldn't, because technically, like, to make a claim for a supplement, the data you're supposed to have is supposed to be very similar to what you would have for a drug. You're supposed to have two well-controlled, placebo-controlled trials, of large enough size that show that that same benefit. And with supplements, you're supposed to have it, and then if the FDA comes and asks for it, then you kind of say, okay, here it is. But unfortunately, with that system, some people, they abuse it, right? And they just launch first, and like, well, if they ever come, then I'll worry about it then.
Yeah, well, I did an example of one of my places I was at. I was like, I could go back to my house right now, get some capsules, put some like flour in them, slap a label around a container, come in this room right now and say, "Hey, this is creatine. I'm gonna charge you $30 for it." And I could tell you, and me being the dietitian, I could tell you, "Oh, here's all the benefits from it," and you would probably buy it. And there's nothing, no one's gonna do anything about it. Like if no one gets sick or gets hurt, I go, that's what the supplement industry is like. It's the wild, wild west.
Yeah, yeah.
And they looked at me like, that's real? I was like, yes, people could just throw stuff on a shelf and just sell it to you, and you could have no clue what's in it if it's not tested.
No, crazy.
So, so cocoa bean. So a couple big things you mentioned, multiple times. I guess I have a question about. Can you go into more like what is a flavanol? And the other really big question that I have is just having a lot of experience with like black currant powder, beet powder. I was going to do my research on beets for my PhD if I continue on with it, and like power-based athletes. But from our conversation, you said cocoa beans and the way nitric oxide is affected is a different mechanism. So maybe explain to us like what is that separate mechanism that we have that produces nitric oxide that doesn't start in the mouth with the bacteria?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So flavanols, from ground zero, right? Flavanols they're the antioxidants in dark chocolate, and they're different than most antioxidants in that their primary advantage or benefit is they're vasodilators. Now, how are they vasodilators? Well, they increase your nitric oxide levels, as you mentioned, in a way, in a pretty robust way. So if you look at, as you know, like measuring nitric oxide is difficult because it's a gas, and it's got a very short half-life, so it's not around for long. So a lot of people, what's typically done is in a study is they'll measure flow mediated artery dilation, which is a fancy way of like what's the flexibility of your arteries. And what you find with flavanols, for example, and you see it with beetroot as well, and some other foods, you can increase that elasticity of your arteries by 25, 35, even 50% by consuming, in this case, daily cocoa flavanols. And that's all, it's all mediated by nitric oxide. So what flavanols do is they increase your nitric oxide levels, and as you said, there's two ways of doing this, of increasing your nitric oxide levels, and they're completely independent pathways. So one is, as you mentioned, like I eat nitrates, food like green leafy vegetables, beets, that starts in my mouth, right? And then the bacteria start to convert that nitrate into nitrite into nitric oxide, and that's one of the pathways. The second pathway has little to do with what you consume. It's more it converts L-arginine, which your body makes yourself, or you can consume it, right? It's in proteins. So it's amino acid. So it converts L-arginine into nitric oxide. And there's an enzyme that does this, the nitric oxide synthase enzyme. And what flavanols do is they supercharge this enzyme. So, so you're able to convert, much more L-arginine into nitric oxide. And the funny thing is when you look at vasodilation and, and flow-mediated artery dilation, the impact that you get with the right flavanol dose is very similar. It might be a little bit more robust than you see with beetroot and some other supplements. But it does raise the question, heck, well, should I consider using both? Right. Like, so, yeah, I mean, you could say,
Yes, you do too at one time.
the other, or like, is there an advantage, like, for a professional athlete, or even like, a weekend warrior like myself who, likes to, like, I cycle, I'm looking for every advantage on the weekends when I go out with my, my old friends, and, we go out for 50 miles and, I try to get up the hill first.
Yeah, and I think one that we talked about offline as well is like, it may be an opportunity for practitioners and athletes where it's a more palatable, visual, textural opportunity that maybe athletes are more willing to do. Just because, as we know, like beets can be very, very earthy, groundy tasting, maybe very challenging to get your athletes to utilize beets. I've come with a variety of different ways, whether it's mixing it with Gatorade, mixing it with a smoothie. I think Beta has a good option where you just have like the shots that are really kind of quick and easy, and you can utilize those too. But at first when we talked about this and I heard, I was like, man, like a lot of people like chocolate, and the taste of that versus the taste of eating a beet is definitely a lot more satisfying. It might be a lot easier to get an athlete to comply with long term versus some of the other options that may be out there.
Yeah, it's funny because awareness and education is important to us, and so we tend to do pretty well, like events, especially like we went to the Boston Marathon this year and had a little table, and you can start explaining what a vasodilator is, and nitric oxide, and some people are interested, or get it, and but when with runners, it's very easy to say, oh, are you familiar with beetroot? Like, rather than go through all this mechanism,
They don't want to hear it. They just want to know, like, what does it do? Can it help me? Can you relate?
Yeah. So it's like, oh yeah. My running coach always wanted me to do it, but I just don't, I just couldn't stick with it. I just don't like, well, I was like, well, this works, on that same nitric oxide pathway. And, it opens up your arteries and vessels, more oxygen, nutrients, we need them just like beetroot, but it's chocolate. And so that's that message goes over pretty well, with a lot of people.
Yeah, because I mean, you look at like protein powders, right? Your main flavors: chocolate, strawberry, vanilla.
Right.
So I mean, it's a very relatable flavor in a lot of senses, just because some of those products, like that's typically like, or you look at ice cream, or it's just like that's one of the mainstream flavors that most people know and most people are aware of. Versus like beets, like it's this kind of like obscure thing over here on the right hand side, and you're like, I eat those once in a while, or like I guess I'll give it a try, and or it's almost like pickle juice or pickles. Like it's a love-hate relationship. Either you love them or you don't like them at all. Versus chocolate, like you might have probably a lot more people that may be able to warm up to that idea.
And I actually I like beets like in a salad or something, but I don't like beet juice. And I certainly, can I tolerate it? Yeah, I can tolerate it. But I mean, I love, I put the cocoa powder on my yogurt every morning, and that's delicious.
So I guess we talked about mentioned research a couple different times. Is there any research currently right now on the use of cocoa or your product specifically with athletes, or is most of the research right now currently like in clinical trials with just regular like gen pop or people have cardiovascular issues? Like what are you finding in the research that may be relatable to the practitioners here that are listening to the podcast?
Yeah, so there's a first of all, there's a ton of research on cocoa flavanols. That's one of the things that really impressed me when I started, because I'm a biotech background, so I get leery when I see one, even that study out of Columbia, right? If it was just one study, I'd be kind of leery to make any, assumptions. So the data is great. The interesting with flavanols is a lot of the earlier research was done on the health side, so the cardiovascular side, cognition. A couple of years, actually, last year, like Harvard did this huge study. This is one of the largest studies of any nutrient supplement or any pharmaceutical of all time, and it was placebo controlled. It was 21,000 people, and this was an older population, so it was 60, 65-year-old population, and they consumed 500 milligrams of cocoa flavanols every day for 3.5 years, and they showed a 27% reduction in cardiovascular death in the group that consumed the flavanols. And even among that group, they asked them, okay, after the study, it was like, okay, did you comply? Did you really consume 500 milligrams a day? And for people that said, yeah, well, I did it at least 3/4 of the time, they had a 39% reduction in cardiovascular, like everything. And I'm just giving you one endpoint, but it was just, heart attack, stroke, everything was lower. And the people that complied, it was even lower. Like, this was kind of startling data. That's one study. On the exercise performance side, like there was a study by Patel that came out a few years ago on cyclists, and they showed that a more efficient use of oxygen in the cyclists that were receiving the high flavanol drink, and they showed an improvement in the time trial. We need more of those studies. I think if you look at the history of like beetroot and flavanols, even though they kind of work in a similar way, most of the early studies for cocoa flavanols have been done on the health side. So there's a ton of I gave you one, but I could give you 25 studies, showing how it improves blood flow, lowers blood sugar, lowers cholesterol, lowers blood pressure, cognition, and so forth. There needs to be, there's a few good studies on exercise performance, but I'd like to see more on that front. And you're starting to see more people do the research there. But we need more studies there with beetroot. More of those studies have been done on exercise performance and relatively fewer on the cardiovascular health, cognition, et cetera.
So now they just need to flip flop. We need to get the research all right, you can spend some time on cocoa now, and then like the health side, we can go push beets over to this side. Okay.
Yeah, the reality is they work in a very similar way, right? Like what's driving the benefit is the same. So you're probably going to see very similar outcomes. Again, we talked about it. I'd love to do it. I wish we're looking into maybe doing a head-to-head versus beetroot, just in terms of vasodilation, because that's how it works, right? My guess is cocoa flavanols might be a little bit more robust, but even if it's similar for us, I'd take that, right? Like, there's
even if it's on the same page, like it just, people like variety and people like options. So
yeah.
If someone loves beets, boom, you could do beets. If someone likes cocoa, you can do cocoa. But at the end of the day, like, we're able to provide several options that people could choose that are providing the effect that we want them to get. And if that's helping their health, if that's in this case, talking to a lot of practitioners, that's helping the athlete's performance, that's all we can really ask for at the end of the day. Like, that's hopefully, I would say, the overall goal. Like, we're just trying to help and improve in some way or some fashion.
Yeah. And then, like we said before, because they have different mechanisms, so even though they're working the same way,
like the B helping like part A, and then like part B, like the cocoa could come in after that. It's like, I guess even there, depending on how fast they digest or get absorbed, like is then there an elongated amount of nitric oxide effect versus a shorter term amount.
Yeah, well, theoretically, they would be additive, because it's like it's a very different mechanism. So
yeah,
theoretically, it would be
that's
additive.
another thing you can look at too. It's like, all right, through dissolving through the mouth or through going through the L-arginine pathway, which, like, what does it look like taking them separately or head to head? And it's like, what does it look like taking them like both at the same time? And is there a longer lasting
Yeah.
effect over that time that's providing the athlete a greater benefit?
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, like with these nitrates, they're telling you to take them 1 to 2 hours ahead of time. But let's just be honest, the last person had the podcast, he's a huge nitrates person, and he was, he had, one of his teams take him like 30 minutes before, and it got like all over social media, and researchers were like, well, that doesn't work. It's 30 minutes before, and it's like the onset time is going to be like several hours at the tail end. And he was like, well, when I need these guys to be at their best is in the fourth quarter or like the last half
Yeah.
of a
Right.
basketball game. He's like, if it kicks in that last 5 to 10 minutes, well, guess what? If they can play their best that last 5 to 10 minutes, and that's where we win games, then who cares what time I take it? Like, if we're just getting it in them and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
having some type of benefit at some point during their game, which allows us to win the game, then you can have all these recommendations and timing and all that, but it may only matter to a certain extent, because if you can't get them to take it in the first place, then we're not even talking about any of the procedures leading up to that point.
That's really interesting. It reminds me of a story. Matt Darnell, who used to do, he was the dietitian for the Steelers. Now he moved on to Exos last year, but he did he was doing a CE program on flavanols a couple of years ago, and somebody asked him the question like, okay, when do you tell the players to consume their cocoa fly? And they were using the cocoa powder at their smoothie bar, and it's like, okay, when should the players? And he said, listen, ideally, like you said, like with flavanol, similar to beetroot, like 2 hours later it's going to peak. So he's like, listen, ideally right before practice or the game, but the reality is with flavanols, and you probably know the beetroot story better than I do, but with flavanols, there's a daily buildup. It kind of looks like this, for 2 to 3 weeks. So there's this natural buildup in your body that so say your vasodilation was 5% on day one, right? After I consume my flavanols, 2 hours later I might be at 7%. But if I just do it once, 6 hours later it's going to be out of my system and be down to almost 5 again, right? But if I do it daily, there's this buildup that by the time I get to 3 weeks, my starting point is maybe like at 8%. So I'm already higher than my peak is at day one. There's always going to be there's always this, a short term, like acute benefit, and then a longer term benefit. So there's always going to be that short term benefit. So even after 3 weeks, so say I'm starting at that 8% level, I'm already starting pretty high. Yeah, that 8% is going to go to 9%. But Matt's like, listen, if they're doing it daily, I tell them I don't really care. I said, like, if you want that extra benefit, sure, do it right before practice. But if you're the kind of person that doesn't like to do that right before practice, then as long as you're doing it daily, I know you're getting 90% of the benefits.
Yeah, and that's like that with a lot of stuff. If it's beets, if it's creatine, certain pharmaceutical drugs in some cases, like a lot of them may not work unless you're consistently taking them like day after day. And like maybe that benefit or the potency may be higher as it goes along, but it may take time for you, like you said, to build up for that to actually have be utilized in the manner and way that we want to. The sad thing, unfortunately, with consumers is if they don't get like that instant benefit in like
Yeah, yeah,
the first time, they're just like, it doesn't work. It's like, no, it's not that it doesn't work. And I tell this to, clients and individuals that work, like, you have to give it. It's just like your fueling plan, right? And learning these behaviors and having these tools.
right.
You have to give me time to be able to help teach you them, develop the behaviors, and then give you skills to then apply them. But that's not going to happen in 1 to 2 days. That may not happen in a week. It's going to happen over multiple weeks. And in this case, the same thing with some of these foods. Like you may have to eat or consume these over multiple days before you actually start seeing a benefit. But that's where it's like you got to give it a couple weeks to commit to it. And that's where I go, if I see it and I just ask how you feeling. Do you feel any different? Did you take it before training? Have you taken it all week? Do you feel any different from taking it for a full week? and just asking a lot of those kind of like probing
Right,
questions
right.
just to see if like they can give you any feedback. And if they can say like, yeah, I have a little more energy levels, like, oh yeah, I felt a little better in like the first 30 minutes of practice or in the game, that could be enough. Like, oh well, a week ago, like you were exhausted, or a week ago, like you told me like you weren't feeling great. And then if you can build the connection between those two different things, you might be able to lock them in a lot easier, and get them to understand like, okay, it took me a week, it took me 2 weeks, I did this, but I am starting to see some benefits. I should probably continue to take it because it's going to keep giving benefits.
Yeah, that's such a key point. It's such a key point. And that's like one reason I tell people, like, they say how to consume it, right? And I say, and I get, I can give them like a lot of different options, but the important thing is you choose something that's part of your daily routine. So it just fits in, right? It's like, so
Yep.
you do it daily. You don't have to think about it. Like, if somebody says, all right, I'll try it in a smoothie. It's like, oh, do daily smoothies? It's like, maybe once a week. Cause like, well, I said, it's not a bad way to consume it, but if you don't do a smoothie every day, maybe, what's an easy way to incorporate it into your routine? Like, what do you do for breakfast? Like, and you kind of work with them and say, okay, like, oh, maybe try that, maybe try this. So
I guess let's go over that then. Like, just I know it's like we just talked about. It's not going to be perfect, and they're going to figure the individual is going to have to figure out how they're going to incorporate. But how much of this should we consume? What is that milligram range? How soon before? Again, just in general, so people have that idea. And then maybe what are some things you've talked about with dietitians and maybe some examples and how they can apply or incorporate this into a meal or a snack, that might be really easy for an athlete to do on a regular basis in their routine and schedule.
yeah, no, good questions. So the first question is, okay, how much do you need? Um, Ideally, like if you look at all the studies, and there's hundreds now of studies, and you want to be between 500 and 1,000 milligrams per day. Like that's when you get the greatest benefit. And if you just look at, again, vasodilation, right, which is the driver of all this. If you do, like our bars have 500 milligrams per serving. The cocoa powder, it's a little, it's more concentrated, right? It's easier to get that a larger amount in there. One scoop is 900 milligrams. The difference between 500 and 900, like you'll get after 1,000, you really it starts to level off, right? It's like
Plateaus.
anything else. It's like one of those curves. 500, you probably get about 2/3, of the benefit that you would at 900. You're still getting a lot of benefit. You're not getting full benefit. So yeah, so ideally, you want to shoot between 500 and 1,000 milligrams a day. How you do it, so a lot of different options. So some people like to put it in. A lot of people do protein shakes, right? Like you mentioned earlier, Sean. Do you do protein shake every day or some kind of shake?
Yeah, once in a while I do for sure.
Yeah. So some people, so you put in a protein shake, that's easy, right? Like I'm doing it, I'm already doing it. A lot of people, like for myself, I start every morning with a bowl of Greek yogurt. And so I put plain Greek yogurt, I put a scoop of the cocoa powder in there. I put a little granola, I put some blueberries, sometimes I put some walnuts or something. I mix it in there. Like I like that. That's my go-to breakfast every day. Like even if I'm going out to breakfast, I'll have that before I go out to breakfast. Like that, I love it. It's a great way to start my day. So that's a good option. Smoothies are a good option. Pure cocoa powder, like you can put it in coffee, but what I tell people is, if you've ever tried to put pure cocoa, but sometimes you get a little that residue like on top, like it floats around. So if you
Yeah.
have one of those handheld
The
immersion,
frothers.
yeah, those
Yeah, we
frothers.
got one of those.
So if you're trying to mix it into liquids, like that's the best thing to do. And the other trick I tell people is, so the chocolate is sweetened. So it's 62% cacao. So it's not high in sugar, but it's got sugar in it. The cocoa powder is unsweetened. And we're a small company, we're just starting out. Like eventually, like will we have different options, like sweetened with stevia, or, maybe one version that has sugar. Right now it's unsweetened. So you sweeten, that leaves it to the
However you want to.
individual to
Stevia or
sweeten.
some honey.
Yeah, yeah, honey. I put, so in my yogurt I put maple syrup. Like that's
Yep.
my sweetener. But yeah, honey's great. But whatever you want. But the key to remember is the cocoa powder is unsweetened. So some people say, "Oh, I don't like things too sweet," and I'm like, "Well, do you eat baker's chocolate?" Like,
Yeah.
because chocolate like doesn't taste like chocolate, unless it's got some, to us, like to Americans, right? Like until you have some sweetener in there. So it is important. Like, my wife will, sometimes she'll make a smoothie and she uses a ripe banana. She's like, I don't need a sweetener but the ripe banana
Yeah, the banana is super sweet. So it just
is
kind of
sweet.
offsets that you don't need it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which so anyway, but those are some common ways. Some people put in overnight oats. You can put it in oatmeal. You can
That's something I might have my fiance try because that's kind of like her go-to breakfast. She almost sticks everything in her overnight oats. Like it's gonna be her oats if we did protein powder, if
oh
it's
yeah,
gonna
yeah.
be creatine, like everything kind of gets thrown into her oats, and she's like, "Oh, this is my one-stop shop, and I can eat this every day, and I can switch it up." And she's very interested in trying it as well because she loves chocolate, so it's not gonna be
Oh,
a hard sell.
she's gonna love it. She's gonna love it. So anything you add cocoa powder. The key thing to remember is, don't um best not to bake with it, because you're gonna lose a third of that. Although I tell you, my daughter makes a mean chocolate cake and she puts it in the icing, and that's not cooked. So actually that's a good little cheat.
Yeah, I'd be interested like the ergogenic effect with like taking the cocoa with caffeine or taking it with creatine and like seeing how that works. I think that could be a really cool study. I know there's more coming out on beets and nitrates, like taking them at nighttime before you go to bed because of the vasodilation effect. And I'll say at nighttime, like we're sleeping, hormones are getting produced. That's when our body's trying to repair itself. That's when our brain is trying to flush and kind of clean itself out. I almost kind of relate that to like a sweeper in a city who's trying to like clean up all the
Yeah,
junk.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Your brain's doing that at nighttime when you're trying to sleep. So it'd be very cool to see the effects in that sense, taking it before bed and seeing if,
Yeah.
getting extra, nutrients, micronutrients, antioxidants, oxygen to those areas when you're sleeping, if that, I would assume, and I feel like it would enhance the recovery process so you feel better upon waking up in the morning time.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I not for those reasons, but I often have some chocolate. I think the way I approach my flavanols, I like, I have my 900 milligrams every morning with the cocoa powder, but we have the chocolate, and I kind of eat that for, as a better for you chocolate, but that mostly at night though. So maybe I'm getting some of those benefits.
Yeah, maybe it's something you just gotta tap into and see if
Yeah.
someone can pull a study off on it. I know Beat It has like a tart cherry and beet like shot. And a lot of times with tart cherry, like you're typically taking that like, after a certain times of the year where your training is like very rigorous and hard. But also you have the tart cherry part, which is high in antioxidants and has the natural melatonin to help with your sleep. So I don't know. Who could
Yeah,
be onto
yeah, yeah,
something? Could be
yeah, yeah.
something Coco could get into. You never know. It could be that path on the road.
Well, and it's funny because another team that's using the cocoa powder right now, and I'm not allowed to talk about the team
Right.
itself, but it is a very competitive team, and they do shots of the cocoa powder and tart cherry. Like that's one of theirs. Yeah,
So there you go.
yeah,
And tart cherry, I mean cherries and chocolate, depending on who you are, can be especially on the holidays, chocolate covered cherries.
oh, that's delicious, delicious,
Could be
delicious.
an opportunity there.
Yeah,
Or, you started mentioning all these examples. Like I'm like, oh, I can make a high protein cocoa pudding. Like you could do a high protein chocolate to cover fruits, like fruits and bananas and apples. So it's like there's just so many things
I
you
like
could do with cocoa.
avocado, an avocado like chocolate mousse, with
Yep.
avocado.
chocolate brownies. It's just so
Yeah.
versatile. There's so many things you can make with it and so many things you can match with it. It just makes the consumption of it in that case a lot easier for practitioners and individuals to incorporate, especially, with how many chefs we have now in the sports world, the professional, the college setting. Some people hiring their own private chefs, and knowing chefs, like, they love new things, they love to be creative, they love to try something that's going to be incorporated that can be different in the menu, because we know athletes get flavor fatigue. It's long seasons that they go through, and you only have so many protein options. You don't have so many carbohydrate options. So when you're able to change the flavors, the textures, the spices, is it creamy, is it whatever, it just makes it easier to have a menu that's going to be different every single week versus like having the same
Yeah,
things
yeah, that makes total sense.
and then people don't want to eat it because it's just the same thing every single
Yeah.
time.
But Sean, you mentioned bananas. So here's an interesting thing not to do. There was a study a few months ago, and it got some pickup. Is that there's an enzyme in bananas. It's actually the one that turns bananas black. When they sit too long on your counter. I've got a few of those right now. That enzyme inhibits the uptake of flavanols by your body. So not just, cocoa flavanols. So we talked about cocoa flowers, right? They're flavanols in other foods too. It's just most concentrated in cocoa beans. So, but red wine has flavanols. Green tea has some flavanols. Blueberries have some flavanols. But if you consume bananas at the same time of any of these foods, it actually inhibits the uptake of the flavanols.
It'd be so interesting just because so many smoothies are mixed with bananas. Like
Yeah.
bananas almost like a base in a smoothie. So I mean, it's almost like I don't know. I would probably need to see more
Yeah, it's
research.
one study. It's one
It's one
study.
study, so I need to see more research on it, and it's going to be pretty hard to skirt around that when like bananas are such a mainstay. And I mean, you go to any place and like it's apple, bananas, and oranges.
Yeah, yeah. And
So
listen, there's a lot of
there's a
other.
lot of things that could compete for absorption. So it's like who knows half the time.
I know, and remember that's only flavanols. That was one
Yeah.
specific study. Blueberries have a lot of other things in there, and hopefully that's not maybe the banana's making some of the uptake of the other nutrients even better. Like we don't know that, but it's just you learn something new every day.
Yeah, it's like multivitamins. People are like, should I take a multivitamin? I'm like, well, if you don't eat a lot of fruit and vegetables, and we got to work on getting that in, like it could be a good blanket to hopefully get some of your micronutrients in. But when you're taking a multivitamin, like there's a lot of vitamins and minerals that could be competing for absorption. So yeah, that says 100% of this. That doesn't mean you're absorbing 100% of it. Like you could have this mineral over here that's saying, well, I'm gonna get absorbed first, and then like just pushes this other vitamin out of the way, and it's like, well, maybe you only absorb 20% of that now. But in your mind and what you
Yeah.
see when the consumer sees is like, oh, I'm getting 100% of my daily value of this. Well,
Right, right.
your body has other ideas when it's going through that process of your stomach and your intestines, like that you don't know about.
It's so complex, so complex.
So I guess to kind of wrap it up, a fun finisher for you. So what is your either favorite drink to use your cocoa powder in, or what is your favorite like snack or meal to use your product in? Like, is it the Greek yogurt, or is there something else that's like your go-to that you like to do?
Yeah, so I mean, my Greek yogurt is that I love that as my go-to every morning. But like a fun little thing to do is I like to create my own little Reese's, because we have the bars too, right? So we have three different flavors actually. So we've got a plain bar, we've got a blueberry bar, and a roasted almond with Himalayan pink salt, which is actually my favorite. But I love the plain, and I'd scoop some peanut butter on it and just
Oh, that's a good idea too.
that is delicious. Yeah, that is really
Maybe
good.
that's your new PM snack. Get some healthy fats, a little bit of protein. You get the flavanols at nighttime, about an hour before
That's right.
bedtime.
And a little protein before you go to bed to help you sleep. Yeah.
There you go. We just gave someone a new idea for the PM
That could be
snack.
it. All right. I'm going to start my own little study. I'll let you know how I feel.
There- So you have the 3 bars, and then is there? You said there's is the powder just the general powder? There's no other options for it. It's just the one.
Yeah, it's the one, that's again, we're small, and so, easier to start in one place that gives people the flexibility. Because, what you find is just, you know, people, prefer so many different derivations, right? Like with chocolate, it's like, oh, why do you have 62%? Why not 80, 90%? Why not this flavor? Why not that flavor? Why not stevia instead of sugar? Like there's so many derivations that, like, as I was thinking with the cocoa powder, well, the good thing with the cocoa powder is, all right, we're starting here. You can make it whatever you want. It's very flexible. And then over time, like maybe you'll have one with protein in it, right? Because a lot of people put it in the protein powder, but at least right now you could put it in your protein shake. So,
I think that's the fault of America is we just have so much variety and so many options that people are just expecting you to have like 30 flavors because everybody has different taste buds, and it's like you don't have my flavors, so like I don't know if I can utilize this or not. And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
funny because I had a professor in undergrad who was in the military prior to like coming into like teaching, and she would just be so funny. She's just like, why do we have to go down the aisle and like there's the yogurt aisle and like it's a whole aisle of yogurt. She's like, we should have plain yogurt and we should have like 6 other flavors. She goes, we're just wasting so much, food and so many options because everyone wants to have 70 options of this and 70 options of that. She goes, we could feed the entire United States and more if we just would like start closing down how many options we provide. But she goes, since we just give people too many options now, she goes like we're almost in a phase like we'll never be able to like revert back. Which I thought was just like I was like, well, like you got a point there, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm a big Aldi shopper. And if you've ever been to Aldi's, like they're like half the size of like a Publix or a Kroger's, and they kind of have that concept where it's like you're gonna go to the yogurt section, like we're gonna have one spot that's just yogurt. Like you're gonna go to the cheese section, like we're just gonna have we're gonna have multiple different types, but it's just gonna be this one section, and there's not 700 different brands that you have to choose from. And in reality, it's smart because the prices are a lot cheaper. You can go through the store a lot faster, and it makes your choosing options a lot
Yeah.
quicker, and it just makes the shopping experience a lot better. Comparison, like you're going to that aisle and like you're a consumer, like oh god, it's like overwhelming. Like I don't know what to buy because there's too many things that I could buy. Low sugar, high sugar, protein, this, 000 that, and you're like, then
Yeah.
you just get to the point where like I'll just
Too
grab
much.
this. It's
It's
just
too
too much.
much. Yeah. And then, from the other side, running a business and trying to like, oh, inventory of this and that. And then the co-manufacturer only wants to make this. It's just like it gets, it's simple. Simple can be good. Simple can be good.
Kiss method, keep it simple, stupid.
Exactly.
And well, and I'm sure you'll get, you probably already have like, dietitians definitely aren't afraid to give, constructive criticism and feedback. So, and especially athletes, they're not going to be afraid to give feedback either. So, you just get all that feedback over time, and you just find out like what's the common denominator, what's the common feedback that we're getting, and that allows you guys to kind of make the shifts and decisions that you need to make.
Exactly.
Like,
Exactly. Which is part of why I love like going to events, whether it's like, whether it's the Boston Marathon or, Fancy, right? The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, like the annual meeting, and just talking to people and getting feedback. Because I mean, that's where you learn. That's where I learn, what works, what I'm looking for, what education do I need, what kind of support do I need, what tastes good, what doesn't, like, products. It's there's no substitute to doing that, which is very different from me because I grew up in like biotech pharma, right? Like working for these large companies, and how often do you speak to the consumer, right? Like
and guess what? Nowadays, like the consumer's making the decision. Like you could think cherries are terrific in your chocolate bar, but if like 80% of the consumers are like, nah, we don't want this, it's like, well, I just wasted money making a product that nobody wants to buy.
totally, totally.
And everything's on social media too. So you go to those huge events like Fancy, and someone's like, "Oh, I love FlavaNaturals," but then they have a 10,000 person following, and then they put one post on Instagram. Now you're part of a whole nother community. So it's just a different world now. Like when you can get in those spaces where there's lots of practitioners and you can get people starting to post on those social platforms in a positive way, like that's where a lot of your growth can happen just because that's where people are consuming their information. So when you can hit those types of areas in those markets, like it just gives you a lot better position to move forward and feedback and be able to make better decisions going in the future.
Yeah, yeah, it's real and it's more fun too, right? It's
Yeah, having
yeah,
having conversations like this is way more fun than emails or text messages. I think I had a conversation with somebody the other day, like when COVID hit and we had to be behind a screen, and then we were all able to like come back face to face. Like that's what the human race does. Like we want to be around
yeah,
other people and have those conversations. Like there's no substitute for that. And like people need to have that interaction. And that's where a lot of ideas and a lot of things spark that put us in a position to be creative and come up with some of these awesome concepts that people do. So I'm all about it, and that's one of the big reasons I have people on is to have these conversations. And someone may listen to this and they may think of something, and maybe it's a researcher, and they come to you and they're like, "Hey, Alan, I want to do research on your
yeah,
product." I'm like,
exactly.
cool. So you don't know what's going to ever transpire from these conversations or talk, which is the exciting part behind it.
No, no, it's so wild. Like there's I'll give you an example, like because just like you, like people ask me to do stuff, like I never turn it down, right? So I was somebody asked me to do like to lead a discussion at Wharton actually. So they wanted to do like a case study, and I kid around like, yeah, I'll tell you what not to do, right? But I would, we were doing a one day case study, and it was the group actually was not, they're people that they were executive MBAs, so they're actually out there working, and they were just doing this like as a part-time thing. And I went one day thing, did the thing, we did some taste testing, we talked about flavanols, talked about nitric oxide, a bunch of other stuff. And one of the guys comes at, after the class, comes up to me, is like, hey, I work for Under Armour, and I think this was really cool. And we should,
Do
would
like
you
a collaboration or something.
want to talk to some people? And I was like, yeah.
Under Armour, absolutely.
And yeah, so it was so we started a dialogue. He's really good guy. He actually played quarterback at Maryland, a few years earlier. And we started talking. We almost had this big deal in place. And like, again, we're this small little company, right? And we had this really intriguing deal in place with it was going to start with MyFitnessPal, which a lot of people use. And they at the last minute, right before we were able to kind of ink things, Under Armour sold MyFitnessPal to it.
Nah.